well-intended development or discrimination. Israeli Palestinian Bedouin protest against plans to resettle them. Israel says the move will benefit the community while preserving its traditions. But is there a bigger agenda at play? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, said that without the Negev, Israel would be hardly a state and hardly Jewish. Now, more than 60 years later, the current government is promoting plans to drastically develop the barren desert region, resettling up to 40,000 Israeli Palestinians in the process. And this was the latest reaction. Thousands took part in what was described as a day of rage in the Negev itself, in Haifa, Jerusalem, the West Bank and Gaza. Israeli Palestinian Bedouins say forcing them out of their ancestral land will destroy their way of life.
The Bedouin lifestyle is an agricultural lifestyle. Forcing Bedouins into townships will take away the Bedouins' main resource, the land.
It's a catastrophic expulsion campaign that aims to empty our villages, confiscate all our land and give it to the state's Jewish citizens. We will continue resisting.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a statement condemning the latest violence. He said, attempts by a loud and violent minority to deny a better future to a large and broad population are grave. We will continue to advance the law for a better future for all residents of the Negev. Well, the Negev desert is in the south of the country. It accounts for nearly 2/3 of Israel's land, but less than 10% of its population, a quarter of whom are Israeli Palestinian. Under the plan, it's reported they would be confined to just 1% of the Negev. The Bedouin community does have Israeli citizenship, but live in what are known as unrecognized villages, many of which lack running water or electricity. Israel says resettling them to state-planned towns is necessary to provide these basic services. But opponents say Bedouin land is being confiscated and they're being moved to make way for more Jews. Well, let's start talking about this straight away with our guests. In Jerusalem, Paul Hirschson, spokesman for the Israeli government. Joining us from Sheffield is Ben White, journalist and author of the books Israeli Apartheid, A Beginner's Guide, and Palestinians in Israel, Segregation, Discrimination and Democracy. And in Nazareth, we have Nadeem Shehadeh, an Israeli lawyer specialising in human rights, who's been representing some of those arrested in the latest protest. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on Inside Story. Nadeem, let me start off with you. Tell us more about your clients. I know that you've been in court with them and what they're saying about what is happening in their hometowns.
Well, right now in Haifa court, now at 4:30 was supposed to be the decision concerning the 21 arrestees that were arrested yesterday in the Haifa demonstration. It should be noted that 2 of them are minors, 4 women, and we are awaiting now for the decision. We should say that the police are requesting from the court an addition of 5 days for the arrests of these people. We argued that they were in a demonstration. They were proving their right to demonstrate against the power plan. And hopefully we'll get a decision soon. I'm hoping that if we get it right now, we will tell you what's going to happen.
And any idea why they were arrested? What they've been accused of doing?
Yeah, they were said that they assaulted the police officers and they had some disturbance to public order.
Paul, maybe you can jump in here and explain to us why some of these demonstrators were arrested. A couple of them clearly minors. What's going on?
Well, you know, I don't really want to get into interfering in the due process of law. Israel has a very well-known and respected legal system and judicial system here. People who are protesting, I believe, although I'd like to check for all the places, without permission, without licenses, although everybody has a right to protest when organized, resorting to violence. I don't think it's acceptable anywhere in the world, but I think it's best to leave the legal side to the due process.
Okay, the government believes that outside forces are getting involved in these demonstrations. What exactly do you mean by that?
I think that if we look what's happened over the past months and years, you'll see that there's been an extensive, deep, consultative process with the Bedouin community in the Negev desert. I'm the last person who's going to say that everybody is in agreement about everything. But there is a process moving forward. The Bedouin themselves have been in a process of settlement and urbanization for years, for decades. Not all of them. And we're seeing that there are people from outside of the region and people from outside of Israel, political provocateurs who are getting involved in the action simply for the opportunity to take a knock at Israel right now. If we look at the substance of what's going on, these people, there are about 220,000 Bedouin living in the Negev, in the southern part of Israel. About 130,000 of them living in conditions which are acceptable to you, to myself, to everybody else, which leaves about 90,000. Of those 90,000, about 60,000 are in places where we are able to bring to them the services which we expect ourselves, the authorities, to supply to the civilian population of Israel, leaving us with 30,000, some of whom are living in areas which have been ruled not livable because of toxic waste in the area. Others are living in areas which are inaccessible. And the bottom line is this: these people are my people. These people are Israelis, and we expect of ourselves to provide healthcare, to provide access, to provide education to the entire population of Israel, and that includes them. That's where we're going, and we're moving forward with that.
Ben, your comments?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what we are seeing when you put aside all this kind of waffly prevarication from people speaking on behalf of the Israeli government is a plan for ethnic cleansing unparalleled in the history of Israel since the Nakba and also since 1967. The Prava plan has been condemned internationally. It's been condemned in the European Parliament. It's been condemned by the UN Committee Against Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And Amnesty International have also slammed it, calling it an example of, quote, blatant discrimination. And actually, there is a lot of continuity between the types of Israeli policies that are unfolding in the Negev and what we see the Israeli regime doing also inside the occupied West Bank. There is not much distance between the sites of the villages that are set to be destroyed in the Negev and Palestinian communities in the southern Hebron Hills that are also targeted by an apartheid regime for destruction, while at the same time Jewish communities are planned and thrive alongside or in the future on top of them.
Let's pick up on what Ben was saying about the international response, criticism over Israel's ambitions here. In July, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, said if this bill becomes law, it'll accelerate the demolition of entire Bedouin communities, forcing them to give up their homes, denying them their right to land ownership, and decimating their traditional, cultural and social life in the name of development. And a statement from Amnesty International shortly afterwards read, the pro-Begin plan is a blatant example of Israel's discriminatory policies towards its Palestinian minority. It must be dropped immediately. Paul, why do you think these organizations are reacting so negatively to this news if, as you say, it's such a good move for the Bedouins, your people?
Such emotive language coming from the previous speaker, precisely the kind of political provocateurs that I referred to beforehand, and as well as Navi Pillay, who, to be fair, is factually incorrect in her assessment of what's going on. What we're talking about are Israeli citizens, my people, my people with whom we have an obligation to provide services to. Anybody who understands what's going on over there in the region will understand that you can either live in fantasy land, you can be a romantic if you want, or you can come down to the ground and you can work towards bringing services. It's not acceptable to me that children don't have access to schools. It's not acceptable to me that the elderly don't have access to hospitals. It's not acceptable to us that people are living without the basic services, whether it be electricity or access to the backbone of the internet and everything else that we expect our people to have.
But other than the provocateurs, excuse me, jumping in here, you've got those Bedouins demonstrating, saying that this is unacceptable. There's a guy wearing a T-shirt saying invisible. They believe that they are invisible. They don't want this law to go through.
Well, you're right, there are people protesting. There are even a few hundreds of people protesting. Maybe you could argue 1,000 or two, but it's a very small minority, a loud minority, a vocal minority. And I'm not going to say to you that everything is perfect, it isn't. But, you know, if we look at what's happened over many decades with the urbanization and the sedentarization of the Bedouin community, if we look at the consultative process that's been undertaken for many, many months, for a few years now, you'll see that the majority of people are not unhappy. There were 3,200 land claims registered, 3,200 of which over 300 have been resolved to the satisfaction of all parties, which I think is clear evidence.
And if they're not satisfied, will you bulldoze their homes? Or, I mean, how does that conversation go?
It's not a question of bulldozing homes. It's a question of bringing services to the public. There are people who are living in areas where it's dangerous to live. I mentioned before, some of them, there are some thousands of people living in an area which is being condemned because of toxic waste in the region. There are other people who are living in places which are simply inaccessible. It's not a question of bulldozing homes. It's a question of building homes.
All right, let's bring in Nadeem here, because you work a lot with those Bedouins living in the area. I mean, do you agree with that claim that there are outside forces at play here pushing these protests along, and that these Bedouin have been consulted throughout the years?
No, I don't think so. I mean, first of all, we should say that there are a lot of alternative plans that were suggested by groups from the Bedouins, groups that represent the Bedouins, to the Israeli government. Plans that have so much. First of all, they are Israeli standards over there, and everything is good. These plans try and keep these unrecognized villages and these people from being uprooted, and at the same time trying to work things with the Israeli government. But the Israeli government and its representatives just don't want to listen. They don't want to listen. They don't want to consult with the Bedouins. They don't want to cooperate with the Bedouins. Oh, that's why you just talked about that a Bedouin saying that he's invisible, because that's how they feel. They want for their villages to be recognized. They want to cooperate with the Israeli government and the Israeli officials, but that's not what's happening. What's happening is that the Israeli government is trying to enforce this plan on these Israeli citizens. It's really important to say that these are Israeli citizens in the end. And that's why they are feeling that they're invisible. That's why they are going out in demonstrations in the streets. And they're trying to just show that the Arabs in Israel are, you have Bedouins and you have the Arabs in the north, and then you have Arabs everywhere. But in the end, it's the same people. They are demonstrating for the same cause. So I don't. In the end, that's what they're trying to do, and they are coming up with plans. It's not that they're sitting there and just they don't want to do anything. They have plans. They have very good plans actually, but none of which was the Israeli government wanted to discuss it with. And another thing I just want to talk about the arrestees. I talked about the arrestees in Haifa. There were 21 arrestees in Haifa, but there were 24 arrestees in the demonstration in the Negev yesterday. 15 of which were brought to court this day, and in their case they still don't have a decision yet too.
Ben, let me put this quote to you from by the Foreign Minister, Avigdor Lieberman. He was saying it's our duty to stop the situation which there are some citizens to whom the laws of planning and construction apply, and there are others who ignore them and use violence to ensure the laws don't apply to them. I mean, he could be talking about the settlers, couldn't he? But he's not.
Yeah, he could, sure. And in fact, there was another thing that Lieberman said last night, which is even more instructive for our examination of the topic today. He talked about what's happening in the Negev as being a fight and a struggle for the national land of the Jewish people. Remember, that is the foreign minister of a government that in theory is meant to be representing all of the citizens of the state. And thus, through statements like that by Lieberman and others, such as Netanyahu, who talked in 2010 about the, quote, palpable threat posed if there isn't a Jewish majority in the Negev. This disgusting racist rhetoric is what underlies the policies of Judaization in the Negev and other parts of the country. And it exposes Israel for what it is, which is an ethnocracy, not a democracy. The kind of rhetoric and policies that no one would consider acceptable in any other country or city or anything like that. And the double standard that is on display in the Negev is very clear, and it exposes the kind of shameless hypocrisy of people who pretend to care about the humanitarian conditions of the Bedouin population there. Because Jewish communities, rural Jewish communities, and isolated single-family farms run by Jewish families were retroactively legalized, were established in isolated locations and have no problems with infrastructure. But the Israeli government refuses to provide that infrastructure or adequate basic services to Bedouin Palestinian communities because the name of the game, which has been the case since 1948 and the ethnic cleansing of the Nakba, is move out non-Jews from particular areas in order to facilitate Jewish settlement and force the non-Jews, in this case Bedouin Palestinian, into as many small shanty towns as possible.
Paul, I'm sure you've got a response to that, and also I'd like to hear from you about what's perceived as a sort of the double standards when it comes to the settlers and the fact that they're breaking international law and you chasing these people off their land for what you're citing as legal reasons.
Well, I mean, I would describe Ben's words as rhetoric because essentially that's what they are if they weren't just patently untrue. You know, I think the conversation is more constructive between myself and Nadeem. What's going on down in the Negev has got nothing to do with removing people. It's got to do with facilitating people. It's unacceptable to us. I don't care what Ben says. It's unacceptable to us that people live without proper services. It's unacceptable to us that they won't have access, as I mentioned before, to education,
instead
to
of demolishing
healthcare.
their homes.
And this is precisely what we're doing, and we're building homes.
But why don't you take the services to those who don't want to move?
For the most part, that's what's happening. For the most part, I said there are 220,000 Bedouin living in the Negev, of whom about 130,000 are in pretty good condition. There's work to still be done there, leaving 90,000. Of those 90,000, 60,000 are going to stay precisely where they are, and we will bring the services to them, which leaves us with about 30,000 people, probably a little bit less than 30,000 people, who are spread out in 2,000 different locations, most of whom will move something in the region of between 1 and 500 meters. That's about it. And there are a few who will have to move a little bit further into safe locations and into locations where they can have access, living their lifestyle, but access to the kind of services that we expect of ourselves to provide to our citizens.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about the bigger policies at play here and how this all pieces together. The Israeli cabinet has approved a 5-year civilian development plan for the Negev region, investing in jobs and housing and pretty much in all areas of life. This will complement the army's move to the desert. There are plans for 4 so-called mega bases by 2020. The idea is to free up army land in expensive Tel Aviv and central Israel for affordable housing. While both projects will bring jobs and investment to the poorest south. Paul, tell us more about how this will work and how this is likely to benefit all Israelis.
Well, first of all, it's about time that we got them to leave the central part of Israel where I live, and we can open a few more coffee shops and a few more high-tech startup companies. So that, as far as I'm concerned, is great news. And as you mentioned at the beginning, the Negev Desert is about 2/3 of the land of Israel. There's an enormous amount of empty land down there, and we'd like to develop it. There's a lot of poor people living down there, Jew and Arab. And this is going to
But essentially they'd be living in different compounds in different towns, won't they?
Well, no, not necessarily. In some places, yes. In some places, no. But there's no legal segregation. If you go to Haifa, where Nadeem was speaking about earlier on, or if you go to many parts of Tel Aviv, it's completely mixed. I go for a walk every evening in Tel Aviv near the university. There are a lot more Arab women, by the way, walking around doing their exercise than there are anybody else. University students who are living in the dorms in the area there. So it's not necessarily, it's true that there are many villages and many towns which are predominantly or even exclusively either Jewish or Arab. That's more by choice than anything else.
Nadeem, what are your comments about these mega bases, and what sort of impact do you think it'll have on the human rights situation in the Negev in the light of what's happening at the moment?
Well, first of all, I just want to talk about another point that related to what Paul was just saying about how they're going to be living in different towns and things like that. I want to bring up the example of a village called al-Hiran. al-Hiran is a village that an unrecognized village that Bedouins live. These Bedouins were moved to this place back in 1956, and there's a document from the Israeli government that proves that. They were moved by the government after 48, and 1956 they were on that land. And right now the government is trying to force evict this village and to build upon it another community, a Jewish community that is called Hiran. So I don't know exactly where this is going, but I mean, just it's so obvious that they are moving people from a certain place that the Israeli government put them there, and on top of that village they are going to build a new one for Jews. So I don't know how this really works with what Paul was talking about earlier.
Yeah, there do seem to be two different stories here. Let me put that to Ben. I mean, if you continue to separate people, I mean, could that not just exacerbate the problem, lead to security concerns?
I mean, what Nadeem just referred to in the case of Hiran is a classic case of ethnic cleansing, moving one group of people away in order to bring in another group. And that's not rhetoric, as Paul wishes to pretend. That's simply the facts of what's happening, what international human rights observers describe as happening, both inside the 67 lines and also inside the West Bank. And Paul's comment about how there's no legal segregation, well, across dozens of communities inside Israel, there are admission committees that filter residents according to so-called social suitability. And those are committees that Human Rights Watch, the International Human Rights Organization, said have been notoriously used to filter out and prevent from living in those communities Palestinian citizens of Israel. And in an extra dark irony, many of those admission committees function in Jewish communities that were built on the land of ethnically cleansed, expelled Palestinians. So this rhetoric about how there's people mixing, about how everything's for all the benefit of all citizens, that's the real rhetoric, and it's a rhetoric that stinks of shameless hypocrisy in trying to cover up the basic facts that are documented by Palestinians, by Jewish Israeli human rights groups, by international human rights groups. And what we see happening in the Negev now is exactly the same as we see happening in the Jordan Valley, in the southern Hebron Hills, in East Jerusalem neighborhoods like Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, where the Israeli regime maintains privilege for one group of people at the expense of another group of people.
Is that the defining dynamic here, what's seen as the expropriation of Arab lands?
No, not at all. The defining dynamic of Israel is that Israel is probably the most exciting venture of the 21st century, and together with that, we're in the process of doing everything we can to resolve our differences with the Arab world, which people like Ben White will probably never forgive the Palestinians when we do reach an agreement with them.
Nadeem, is one of the big problems here that people maybe don't care about the Bedouins? I mean, they've hardly been in the media. Not many people know what's happening with them. I mean, where you are people interested in their fate?
Yes, I think that like in the past 3 or 4 months, people are increasingly asking and trying to understand what the situation is in the Negev. Until it was passed, until the bill passed the first reading in the Knesset, there weren't really a lot of attention to the plan, not by the mainstream media, not by the majority of the Jewish Israelis.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Paul Hirschson, Ben White and Nadeem Shehadeh, my guests. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. You can find this programme and many others at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Why not like us while you're there? Thanks for watching. I'm Jane Dutton. Bye-bye.